And speaking of keeping the conversation going, we talked about the policy, political, how do we get everyone onboarded and socialized to the idea? So now we're going to talk about some fun stuff, the design and construction. I've got some construction folks in the house who I'm sure will appreciate this next topic, as all of us I'm sure will as well. Without further ado, though, I'd like to introduce our panel moderator. All the panelists are here, very good. Katherine Darnstadt is an architect and founder of Latent Design, an award-winning urban design practice at the intersection of architecture and community development, creating social, economic, and environmental impact beyond the building. That's pretty cool. Leveraging design as a tool to make the invisible forces impacting a project visible through architecture. The firm's collaborations range from small-scale tactical interventions, new construction community buildings, adaptive reuse, neighborhood master plans, and design speculations throughout the Midwest. Katherine has been featured and published nationally, so she's popular, everyone. You have to look her up. As an American Institute of Architects Young Architects Honor Award, congratulations, the Crain's Chicago 40 Under 40, and the Venice now I'm going to say this hopefully right, biennial, I learned a new word today, everybody, yay, and previously taught at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Northwestern University. So she's smart, popular, and is about to drop some really cool wisdom on you with the panel. Welcome, everybody. Let's give a warm round.
Thank you for that introduction and morning, everyone. In addition to that, I'm also very sleepy because I do a lot of things. One of them is going to be talking with this great panel here today to take all of that policy discussion and how are we manifesting that into practice. And so how I want to open up so you get to meet these amazing people and where their perspective on ADUs is. We'll start with an opening question is, who are you? What do you do? And what's your first question you ask to a potential someone interested in ADUs, whether they're a client, a contractor, a partner? Nicolle, let's start with you. Who are you? What do you do? And what's your first question out of your mouth?
My name is Nicolle. I am in the arts and entertainment business for a long time here in Chicago, and actually went to the School of the Art Institute. I have a background in some design, construction, that sort of thing. And that's what sort of prompted me to take on the project of building my own freestanding ADU. When I found out about the program in February of 2021. And I started a website to document the process. And so I've actually had quite a few people approach me and ask me questions about how to get these things started. Most of them have been people who are in similar situation as me. They are property owners. Maybe they want to be their own GC, which is what I approached the project with. And for the most part, those people are asking me, they're standing there, hat in hand saying, is it possible for me to do this on my own? And depending on the time of the day and the part of the process I was in, it may have taken longer or shorter for me to answer that, yes, it is possible for you to create this thing and learn these skills and develop this opportunity for affordable housing in Chicago, which is the important part.
Yeah, and I think that's probably every project's question you ask back is like, are you sure?
Yeah.
You want to go through this. Russell, from your perspective, who are you? What's your perspective? And, what's your first question?
Sure. Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Russ Rydin. I'm with CMHDC. We are a large nonprofit affordable housing provider. We have properties throughout the city of Chicago, and also a little bit into the suburbs in Evanston and Cicero. I guess we have a lot of buildings that are kind of your typical walk-up type properties. So these are our properties, many of which have garden units or have storage space or something that can be converted. There's never been a real good opportunity until recently to do that, but we have, I think our portfolio, we've got about 700 units total and maybe 30 or something different buildings. And a lot of those buildings have potential in them. The project we're going to talk about is a mixed use building where we converted retail space into housing units, affordable housing units. But my question is kind of the same: is, are you ready for it? It's a big undertaking. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of money. And you got to be prepared for that. I think, I mean, that's the question I have back is just, are you ready? Are you ready for it? Where you got to go through.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then Robbie, yourself?
Hello there, everyone. Great to be here with you all this morning. Robbie Markus. I'm a worker owner, as we say, and the general manager of Evanston Development Cooperative. We are a worker-owned cooperative focused on designing and building inclusive, resilient neighborhoods. So we've been around for around 4 years at this point, got incorporated in 2018, and we spent several years working quite closely with the City of Evanston staff on their accessory dwelling unit ordinance. Worked with them on that accessory dwelling unit guidebook, which was supported by AARP, and are a design builder of all electric new construction accessory dwelling units mostly, with prefabricated structural insulated panels. So to Katherine's question of sort of what question do we ask, it's when we get a call from someone who's interested in ADU, it's always, why are you taking on this project? Because as Swasti sort of pointed out, there are many reasons why people choose to do this, and that initial answer to that question affects everything from design to budget to site planning and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Robbie. And finally, Monica, introduce yourself and what's your first question?
I have lots of first questions, but I'll start with an introduction. So Monica Chadha, founder and principal of Civic Projects Architecture. Our work ranges from nonprofit community centers through to education spaces, through to museums, through to a lot of multifamily housing. So we're founded around civic engagement and community outreach to actually define our projects. And we are also developer, owner, property manager, and GC for a lot of multifamily units. So I'll be wearing a couple of hats in this conversation. All of that means it's incredibly complicated. But my first question, particularly because most of the calls we get are City of Chicago, is where do you live? So I can look up the ward to tell you the sad story that you're not in the it is difficult to explain that to people. It's like, you've heard about this thing, but you're not in the pilot. And then my second question is usually, what's the exact address, so we can go through zoning and other criteria. So it's not fun to lose a client before you've even had the conversation, but I really don't want people pursuing things that aren't viable in that moment.
Yeah, that makes a good point. And, another piece of advocacy of why the pilot program areas should expand across Chicagoland, to make that more accessible. And I think to both Monica and to Nicolle, you both mentioned you're wearing a lot of hats. Like Monica, you have a lot of hats that you're wearing through your different companies that you have. And then through Nicolle, you wore a lot of hats just building your own coach house for yourself. And so starting with Monica, how do you know, like, how do you know your role on a particular project? Where are you coming in as an architect versus as a homeowner or a developer because you have both coach house and basement ADU conversion. So how do you know what's the right role, and kind of where do your perspectives narrow or expand based on a project?
So I'm an architect first,
Mhm.
I think is where I would define stuff. So we use that knowledge either through defining the viability of the project or actually doing the design, the construction drawings of the project. I have the benefit of, so I'm owner of the architecture firm. My husband and I are co-developer, and then he actually wears the hat of GC. So complicated, but it actually helps us, like, so what we're able to do is the 360, you know, return existing structures to productive use. That's fundamentally what we're trying to do. And in terms of the hats, honestly, it depends on kind of where we are in the process, because we have to identify the project, then look at its viability and feasibility, and then actually execute the project. A lot of partners that we've worked with are in the room, CIC being a really essential partner for us in the work that we do. And because our stuff is primarily South Side, we're returning buildings to productive use in really under-resourced areas. So the viability and the ability, and I know some of your other questions might get into sort of cost and feasibility of doing these, but it starts with the building, because almost all of our multifamily is returning housing to productive use, and abandoned buildings to productive use.
And then for Nicolle, where you built your own coach house, and was the intent, was that the intent when you started this project? I know you're representing a homeowner's perspective that isn't necessarily the majority in the audience, but you know, what drove this project and how did you end up laying all the tile for it?
Yeah, I mean, it was a simple thought initially in February of 2021. I needed a new garage. And so I started looking through those options, discovered the ADU ordinance was close to passing, and being in the arts and entertainment business, February of 2021, I had a lot of time on my hands. And so I took that opportunity and sort of my stored up energy and creativity and dug into my community to help me find people to help me address certain situations, certain aspects of it. And then from there, I just sort of started putting one foot in front of the other, which is how anything in life gets done. Just one foot in front of the other. You come across things where you stumble, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, keep going. And yeah, the intent was to create a big, beautiful brick building that was hopefully in 10 years will be indistinguishable from my front two flat.
Thank you for that. And some photos are scrolling behind of the projects and Nicolle on some scaffolding for just for verification.
Yes.
What you say is true.
I promise.
So Robbie, I'm sure that's not how you open up conversations when you're working through projects with clients. It's like, we'll build 75% of it, you build the other 25. In your intro, you talked about how Evanston Development Corporation, you know, really focuses on all electric, and then through, you know, your construction typology with SIPs. Can you explain some of the benefits that you're realizing through, you know, being a little bit ahead of the curve, both on all electric and then, you know, with your construction types?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's a climate crisis in the 21st century. And so we're trying to think about how we can address that on new construction projects. I mean, I recognize the carbon emissions that come from just transport in terms of getting materials to the site. Yeah, what we really do through framing the house is build an extremely energy efficient structure through structural insulated panels. So this video that's coming up is an affordable ADU that we finished that's restricted at 60% AMI in partnership with the city of Evanston. So it was a really tight lot in terms of width. So we did have to build the apartment on the second floor, but it's a 2-bedroom household, and the public schools in Evanston are fantastic. So the goal with the city was to make it big enough for a small family to be able to live there. And it was built with SIPs. So, you know, we learned from this project. We built it with batted insulation. In retrospect, I think we're now learning we want to do closed cell insulation to really get a tighter building. Still the blower door test came in below 3.0 ACH, 2.52 ACH 50. So especially for affordable housing, that's an extremely airtight structure, and that just means you need less energy to heat and cool the building.
Thank you for that. We love seeing buildings get built in 30 seconds or less. It's my favorite part of the job, managing expectations. Russell, you're working, with existing buildings and the transformation of, currently some atypical spaces. You're going from commercial to residential and different situations like that. Can you explain a little bit more what your process is and how are you making it financially feasible for your organization to undertake some of these conversions?
Sure. So I guess our process is, when we look at our existing portfolio, do we have opportunities in basements or something? Is there room? And we do have some buildings that do have that. The building, I don't know if we have a slide of my project, but yeah, so our project, this is 91st and Beverly, so south side, but this was done all pre-ADU. We typically don't own commercial space. We're affordable apartment owners. This building was a fantastic building that just happened to have some commercial space when we bought it, and basically was vacant for almost 20 years. This is next to a metro stop, but unfortunately, this is the only commercial in the area. This is all single family homes, kind of a very quiet, very stable neighborhood. We love the neighborhood, but not a good commercial area. So our commercial spaces never got leased, or if they did get leased, it just, lasted a year and then they were gone. So not very viable. So a few years ago, we finally said, all right, well, there was early talk of the ADU, and we said, well, maybe this is the time to start looking at it. We had to go through the full process, zoning, permits, everything. We didn't have the benefit of really anything at that time. So it was kind of a painful and long process. But for us, we couldn't add additional affordable units in that particular neighborhood any other way. There's no other space. There's no other buildings available. There's no other multifamily buildings in that particular little pocket. So this was really the only way we could add units in this area we liked, and do so, hopefully at a cost point that wasn't too bad. And we were able to bring it to, a cost point that was okay for us, but from our standpoint, this was 7 units that we created. It was just under $1 million in total costs. So it was pretty substantial. We happen to be fortunate and have capital, have lines of credit, and have a lot of great banking partners that we work with, including CIC and Bank Financial, a couple others. So we were able to do this, but it was a big undertaking and quite expensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And you have, for your organization, you kind of have a number that works for these conversions. Monica, for you, when you're kind of coming in as an architect, throughout the last, since the ADU pilot program launch, have you been changing anything in terms of your designs or recommendations to kind of manage budgets on ADU conversions?
So during the break, we were talking about budgets. They're not cheaper to build. In a lot of cases, they're more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's another managing expectations and conversation, particularly with the escalated costs that we're seeing through the pandemic. But we want to work to build more affordable rental. Garden units, coach houses make sense, but they're not any cheaper to build. So I'm kind of I'm circling around the question, but that's been a challenge that's continually posed to us. And then that balance between what you need to add to legalize these units, it's hard, right? Like if we come in as architects, we're going to tell you whether or not it meets code. We're going to tell you whether you've got legal exits. We're going to tell you what we need. The changes in city code now talk about triggering sprinkler requirements when you add units to the basement. So you're talking about all these layers. And so we're very early stages. We'd rather sit down and sort of talk and walk through all of these steps, because once you put the sprinklers, add the exiting, do the modifications, like I can't make you an ADU cheaper than it would cost to renovate. So if you have a 6 flat, there's the conversation of if that's developer owned, adding 2 units to add to the housing stock. But then as an individual, because there was a comment, I think earlier about, non-conforming or illegal basement units, and there's a very challenging cost to building owners, homeowners who want to absolutely do the right thing by every intention, but then are struggling to manage those costs.
Yeah.
There's a lot of units and situations where people honestly just don't know they're non-conforming units because they've bought buildings or homes with garden units that they're just not aware whether that was done
Mhm.
legally or illegally.
Right, right. Because it pre-existed their current ownership.
Yeah, it's like, I bought it, it was there.
Right.
Can there be anything wrong with it?
Right, exactly. And
Um,
do you see, for you, Robbie, do you see that happening? Most of your projects, I think, are in Evanston. Are you seeing some of the same kind of code conversion concerns, like when you're working through an existing unit? And then, how are you managing costs?
Yeah, so on the code and conversion item, we haven't run into it directly, though, in our policy work. We're just hearing about it. I mean, I was just talking with a small multifamily landlord in Evanston who bought an existing duplex and the basement had been rented out. It wasn't a compliant accessory dwelling unit. And yeah, the city came in on it, and he's got to work on making it a compliant ADU. And I think it's mostly there, but it's not a compliant ADU under code. From a budget perspective, I think we're in the same boat as the person at Oak Park communicated in terms of what types of construction we're seeing in Evanston. They're mostly the detached ADUs, which from a budget perspective are the most expensive ones to build. And I think part of that is an awareness thing that most people don't realize. You can convert your garage, that you can build something that's connected to the garage, that you can, build an attachment to the existing house if you have the lot coverage and impervious surface coverage for it. There are a lot of different options that maybe have different price points. And I still think a lot of people in Evanston, and I can't speak to Chicago, just when they think of this, just think of something in the backyard that's separate from the main house. And so I think in terms of education and awareness that there are different types of projects you can take on that have different price points would go a long way in terms of the budget discussion. Because I know in LA, there are a lot of permits being pulled on the garage conversions.
Mhm. Thank you for that. So that's one kind of lesson we could, Chicago folks can learn from Evanston or the surrounding suburbs, is just looking at different conversion options. And maybe that's a recommendation to think of for future iterations of not only ADU or coach house code, but like increased accessibility, as was mentioned on the previous panels. Like, we can't make an accessible ground floor ADU if it's a coach house, right? Because of our parking requirements within single family homes. So all of that starts to tie together. Nicolle, for your question, since we're talking a little bit about money and the financing and all that, how did this all come together for you? Like, as a homeowner, where did your financing come from? Did you go out for a loan? Did people look at you cross-eyed when you were asking for, telling them what you were going to do and how you were going to pay for it?
Yeah, I stopped telling them what I was going to do.
It was just a general home renovation at that point.
Because, at 81, there's a lot of that. And yeah, I approached 5 different banks
Mm.
and was rejected 5 different times. And I was just looking for a refi on my 2-flat that I'd owned for 6 years and done a lot of work inside. And then I connected with, actually, if anybody has listened to the WGN show that's hosted by David Hochberg. Anybody? Yeah, he's a card. But he has a show and he talks about, home purchases and that sort of thing. And I reached out to him and he connected me with somebody who was able to provide me with the refi. And then I had another situation where I had partnered with some people during the pandemic and started a small business that was a virtual events and entertainment. And so I got some money out of that situation. And then I just squeezed my pennies until, Abe Lincoln shed a tear.
Mhm.
And took every opportunity I could. I, bartered with people I knew, people in my community. I learned skills and trades. I am now technically a finished carpenter. How do you do? Anything that the city would allow a non-city certified contractor to do, I
You
took
ended up
on.
doing,
Yeah. But it was possible. It was doable.
Yeah. Russell, from your end, from financing, you mentioned, you have some partners in the room. CIC has been, named a couple times on these projects, but have you had any difficulties at a larger scale trying to secure financing for some of these conversions, knowing they're a little bit higher than average?
No, but I can just say because we've got a lot of lending partners and we're fairly well capitalized, but, it's tough. I mean, it's tough to, they're expensive, and working within the existing buildings, like they said, sometimes is more expensive. So that's a challenge, but we've been fortunate in that we've been able to work with our banking partners and been able to raise the money to be able to do it, but we're doing it a little bit, I guess, bigger scale in some ways. So
Monica, I saw you move the mic, so I know you're going to say something.
Well, I just wanted to add, because I think this is something that was mentioned earlier this morning. So all our work is not city subsidized. There's no tip finding, there's no nothing. This is similar to you. It's a challenge to kind of put those buckets together. It's part of why we're GC for our own projects. But I think we have to find a way to make this able to be constructed where it's not relying on subsidy, because otherwise we're not creating we're not self-perpetuating, right? It's like, oh, well, if the city doesn't have money, I'm not going to build these affordable units. Well, that's a problem. So I see kind of lots of nods, but I think that's something all of us are encountering in different ways.
Agreed. It's the same on our projects where we had one coach house. One of our first coach houses was in the South Pilot Zone, owner occupied, fit all the narrow requirements that are in the South and the West sides to do a coach house, couldn't get the financing for it. Our one that's broke ground after 8 months of permitting, if anyone's from DOB, these narrow eyes are for you. That one's going up on the North Pilot Zone. And then, the variety of basement units, to Monica's point, it's, some of them are just dead in the water before you even get off the phone call because, there's a lot of restrictions to that. To leave time for Q&A, I'll have a closing question. I'll start with you, Monica. From your perspective, I think you touched on a couple of these, but what incremental solutions can you recommend moving forward to increase not only ADU occurrences, but also make, this a better program overall?
So I think I'll throw two things into the hat. So this has got to stop being a pilot and has to be citywide. I don't know that there's too many people who would disagree. The inequitable distribution of it right now is a problem. Along those lines, I actually think we have to expand some of the requirements because we are not owner occupied in the way others are. And I understand a lot of the parameters around it, but if someone has a 4, 6, 8 unit and can provide 2 additional units in the basement, I don't know that has to be restricted by owner occupied, but if some of the restrictions are modified and the areas in which you can build them are expanded, I think that would go a long way to increasing the numbers we're seeing right now.
Agreed. Robbie, from your perspective?
Aside from financing reform at the national level, which is maybe outside of our scope today, right now, something we're working on in Evanston is pre-approved template plans. So this is something we've been talking with, especially the city of Seattle about, because they've rolled out a really great program on it. They've said it only accounts for about 10% of their ADU permits that are being pulled, but the goal is to reduce design fees and not start custom, right? So reduce the time that it takes to design a unit and just make design more accessible, especially to moderate income homeowners that are trying to figure out how to start this project and figure out which way is up. Also have some conversations with the Building and Inspection Services division, which we're doing about what parts of an ADU could be pre-approved in the permit review process. And what we've learned from the city of Seattle is, you know, if we can get like the foundation detail and the framing plans and the house to stay the same every time, that could be pre-approved, but the zoning is going to be different every time, right? The site's going to be different, utilities are going to be different. And so even with a pre-approved unit, we're still going to need zoning review, but maybe there are aspects that could be streamlined.
Mhm. Thank you for that. Good notes. Russell?
I would agree with what they said. I think that the key is really peeling back those restrictions and opening up the entire city. If it's outside the city, obviously you want suburban areas that are cooperative too, but I think really getting rid of a lot of those restrictions, the owner occupancy, I think that doesn't make sense in a lot of circumstances. Things like that to make it easier. Our project, I think we spent over 8 months in permits and zoning. You know, expediting that kind of thing would be fantastic. But yeah, I think standardization and opening up it more would be great.
And Nicolle?
I started this process really early after the ordinance was passed. And there was so much confusion and lack of clarity and lack of transparency in the Department of Buildings. And in fact, as I was going, after I had been approved, I was approached a number of times with DOB coming back to me and saying, oh, but we forgot that this needed to be taken care of, or this needed to be taken care of. And that threw a wrench in not only the process, but also the confidence to create it. Of course, you know, in terms of the affordability of it, the funding, the streamlining of the process are all really important, but also having really clear guidelines, transparency, so that it's something that both the designer I worked with and the expediter and myself would all be able to approach it in a much more sort of calm and fleshed out fashion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And with that, in our last like 10, 12 minutes or so, if you have a question for the panel, please raise your hand. I'll call on you. You know, you have the mic at your table, and tell us who it's directed to on the panel. Yes.
So my question is kind of a bridge between the previous panel and this panel. We have worked in adding units in Oak Park, Evanston, Bensonville, and Chicago, so we've kind of seen it across the board. And a lot of the questions we have is how much is this going to cost up front, which is very hard to tell people. But I think having something where we can add into all of the guidelines on, you know, when does electrical need to be changed? Because usually it's 99% of the time. When does water service need to be changed? Also 99% of the time. And coordinating it between the front building changes and the rear building changes, I think needs to be addressed very early on, even on a document formulating anything with zoning. I think that will really help homeowners and developers know what the cost is going to be.
So I guess, does anyone on the panel want to answer the comment? Yeah, you know, it's a good suggestion, because I think I do have a question to that. In Chicago, we have, like, for homeowners, they have when do you need a permit and when do you don't need a permit. It's a very simple bullet point on the website. Can we do something similar? Because you can't advocate, you can't say it's going to cost you 10 grand for this. Like the city, we know they can't give specifics, but can they give when is this needed versus when is not for ADUs or any types of conversions? I know for the previous panel, I don't know if Oak Park or Bensonville does something similar in general, but I think Monica, you wanted to answer that.
Yeah, I think you're actually raising a good point, because even though we can't necessarily talk to the exact costs, the fact that these are the considerations, right?
Mhm.
You may need new water service. Yes, I would almost argue 100% of
Yeah.
the time. Electrical, if you're not under a certain capacity, but I actually think guidelines and templates that are developed for the city of Chicago need to actually include this much more so than a patterning of the architecture. And I have to say that because we often think that, oh, if I've got the template, then I can go. Well, architects are not your most expensive thing, right? Like you can pay an architect for a fraction of the cost. You
Yeah.
can do new water service or new electrical. So
Mhm.
it's allow the space to design and make it unique to you. But if we could just start like almost like a checklist of like, here are the 5 things you should check before you even start, right? Maybe we're not saying how much, but like imagine if you just had here are 6 things to consider.
Right.
Yeah, that would have been absolutely game changing, for sure.
And that goes to the comments around transparency, standardization, and a general awareness, we have the zoning side, we have the building department side, we have the building inspector side. Not all of them know what's going on, a project, or especially a new code, which is only 2-3 years old. It's new. It's going to be new to somebody for the next decade, right? And we have to kind of help standardization both externally and internally. Other questions that people have for the panelists? They're very nice. Don't be shy. Yes.
Yes, my question is for Russell. Russell, out of the 7 units that were created from commercial space, what were the bedroom size?
There is 5 1-bedrooms, a 2-bedroom, and a studio, I believe.
Okay, and what were the rents? What are the rents on there?
They're all, I don't know specifically, I can't tell you exactly what they are, but they're all within 80% of median income. That's our mission. So and we've got a couple accessible units that we were able to build there too.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Curtis?
Yeah, I think Monica mentioned it, but I had a thought, and maybe there's some others that would be able to comment on it, but I think you had mentioned people coming to you and you basically, one of the initial conversations is, are you even in the pilot area? How do we get that information back to either the alders or the departments? People searching Cityscape, Chicago Cityscape, that are realizing that they can't do it. I mean, half the battle is we're not, I guess Daniel was mentioning it earlier, like we need to know that there's people interested in this outside of the pilot areas. How do we trickle that information back up so we can actually get rid of these, the pilots, so make it citywide?
I do think, I like that you mentioned Cityscape. There are a few resources that need to be made more, except like awareness, right? Know that they're out there because an example like that, you could actually like, here is my address. What can I do? Oh, it's not in the pilot. But if there was a way maybe to start collecting that the data goes back, the part of the issue is different. This was mentioned earlier, but different aldermen have different opinions on this. I literally don't know how you change City Hall because that's kind of what this would take, right? But if there are resources like looking at ULI, looking at CIC, like if there's others that can help collect, I think that you would find that pretty much all of this audience and many others would be happy to share the information.
Something I've seen in the state of California, where, very progressive ADU legislation meets venture capital in Silicon Valley is, I know there's one startup that's doing software as a service to municipal governments focused on like an online ADU portal. You plug in your address and it tells you, are you able to do this? What zoning district are you, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying the private sector should solve this problem, but I am saying that, more accessible public tools for people to understand, can I do this? I think are very useful.
I would love to see the alderman's offices have somebody who has information and knowledge and like have that be a first step, because they're there to be our community connection. And they are intended to be our connection to the city of Chicago. And even now, as I field inquiries through people that I know or my website or whatever the case is, they will approach their alderman's office. The aldermen have little to no information about it, and they should, in my opinion, be charged with collecting that information and disseminating it back.
So I think Daniel, I don't know where he moved to, but I think this is all becomes some of the first tasks for your ADU hire, because you're hearing right here what people are looking for in the first questions to ask. There is a question over here.
Yeah, so sort of in the spirit of the streamlining and affordability, is there a world where modular fits in to this policy?
Do you want to start with this, answer?
We've never done modular. So I'm not too familiar with the code and where the state's at around modular construction. What we're doing right now is prefab, and even with that, you know, there's still sort of some back and forth and different perspectives that we're seeing in the city of Evanston on quote unquote how prefab or modular you can go. Like our panel manufacturer will let us run, you know, they'll run conduit through the walls and ship it to us on site, but the city won't allow that.
Yeah.
So those are the types of things that we're seeing as we try to implement those types of technologies. Yeah.
And I think we've worked on modular before and prefab, and I think, yes, it's allowed in Chicago. There's a couple great modular companies in the city who are working through it. I think with ADUs specifically and coach houses specifically, sorry, it's can you actually get the module to the backyard?
Yeah.
So there's a logistical issue that I think stops it. So where prefab makes more sense, I mean, at least in the city of Chicago, you have narrow alleys there, a rat's nest of wires behind there. You have to crane it over a primary building on the lot. And that's just a logistical issue that maybe is solved by just carrying it instead, you know? So,
Yeah, we've, on one project, we did SIP roof panels. On others, we've just done a conventional roof and SIP wall panels. And to Catherine's point, yeah, SIP roof panels in an alley, and it was it was a learning process. Yeah, there are site access issues. Yeah.
the captain's here, so does this mean one last question?
So this is a general question for all of you, and I guess the whole room in general, but if homeownership is America's way to build wealth, how do we use ADUs to increase wealth for communities of color while not increasing the wealth gap by the people having access to financing our homeowners already?
Quick question. Yeah.
That's only going to take the same amount of time that speed build.
Anyone on the panel want to start? I think it's a good lunch question too. It's like when we have more time for that.
I mean, it's got to be financing reform. I've seen self-help do some interesting work on the West Coast around piloting a mortgage product with an intentional focus on working with homeowners of color. I was on another ADU panel with Next City with this Keys to Equity program that Chan Zuckerberg Initiative's getting behind. And they're doing some really interesting work around this pilot in Oakland, focusing on intentionally addressing the racial wealth gap as a way by having the ADU be a rental income stream for an income qualifying homeowner. You know, they're piloting a mortgage product, which, you know, the two big issues around ADU financing, I think there's a financing panel coming up, but
Yeah.
I think oh, go ahead. Thank you. Go ahead. Thank you very much. No, I think that's a beautiful stopping point so that we can transition into that next panel. So see, you kind of forecasted and we didn't even plan that. See? Yes. Before we go, I want us to give another round of applause to Monica, Robinson, Russell, Nicolle, and our very awesome Katherine for your powerhouse moderating skills. This was a great panel. Thank you so much, everyone.